Hello and welcome to Newspeak. My name is Emma Webb and I'm joined by Peter Whittle, the director of the New Culture Forum, Mark Sidwell, the author of The Long March, and commentator and historian Rafe Hadelman-Koo. This week we are going to be discussing something that has occurred in between the last episode and now, and that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think, should we just dip straight in? I know, Rafe, you've obviously got family connections to Ukraine. Do you want to start by giving us a kind of potted history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine over the last decade or so?
Sure. Well, let me declare that interest first, because I think it's an interest which explains my perspective on Ukraine, and it's a rather different perspective to that traditional binary view we get now in the West, in the UK, in the US, in Western Europe, which has on one side the neocons and the EU liberals saying Putin is mad, and then on the other side you've got the Putin apologists who say that this is all due to NATO expansion if you're on the extreme left, and now increasingly if you're on the extreme right also, that this is due to NATO expansion, and actually we love Putin because he's anti-woke and anti-West, and he's a strong man. And as with all things, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And if you want to understand the Russian situation best, I always think it's best to ask its neighbours. Those are the people that know it best: the Poles, the Hungarians, the Romanians, Moldovans, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. They have a clear understanding of what Russia is like. Unfortunately, in this country, we seem to, and in the West, we look at everything from a World War II perspective. This goes back far longer. Whether you're dealing with a Tsar of a Russian Empire, a Secretary General of Communist Soviet Union, or the President of a Republic, Russia's game plan for its Western neighbours is always the same. It's domination and its conquest. Now, I don't have any Ukrainian blood myself, but much of Ukraine, all of Western Ukraine basically, used to be Polish territory, and my Polish family lived there for centuries. Many of my ancestors were actually governors of the whole of the Ukraine. In fact, if you go to Lvov, as the Poles call it, Lviv, people will see on their TV screens every day now, the oldest civic statue in Lviv is of my ancestor, who was a famous Polish military commander who saved the city from invasion in 1695 when the Tatars were invading. And that statue stood proudly until the Russians last invaded, when with shades of BLM, they removed the statue in order to expunge all traces of Polish and Ukrainian cultural history from the area. So it's a far more complicated scenario than just to say, as Putin wants to say, that modern Ukraine is Russian. There are two Russias. Ukraine is an artificial modern construct created by Lenin, expanded by Khrushchev. This is all nonsense.
And there are two aspects to this, aren't there? That on the one hand, Putin is I'm told, is a very well-read man, and he obviously, not necessarily being a former KGB agent, having sympathies with Soviet Russia and wanting to rebuild the Soviet Empire essentially, but also that there is a connection, I believe, also with Russia's more ancient history and Putin's desire to reclaim Ukraine as being something, and Kiev specifically, as being something that he views as integral to the Russian identity. Is that something that you think is also motivating?
That's absolutely right. So Putin has said that the worst event of the 20th century was the loss of the Soviet Union and the dismantlement, which is a pretty bold statement given the other events that took place in the 20th century. But he goes beyond that. He looks at the Russian Empire, and you sort of wonder whether the last 2 years of COVID lockdown, he's been locked away in the basements there at the Kremlin, poring over these old maps and fantasizing about all of this, in his little isolation, as we know that he's been in for a while. But yes, he's giving a very potted history, a very inaccurate history, suggesting that all Russian speakers in the world should be united under what's called the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and that the Ukrainians and the Russians are a jedny narod. There is no distinction. That's absolutely rubbish. I mean, by the same token, Australians, Kiwis, Canadians, South Africans and Americans should all be part of Mother Britain today. It's an absurd statement to make. And the Kievan Rus argument is that, is really an argument, I would say, in favour of Ukraine taking over Russia, because Kievan Rus is a far older element. Kievan Rus was the originator of the Russian people, but that was in the Ukraine. 988, Saint Vladimir Christianized the land there. But to draw a parallel, for people to understand this, it's almost akin to saying that America has a right to invade the UK because it's the junior partner to that union, in the same way that Russia is the junior partner to Kiev historically. Or you could look at it the other way and say, look, imagine Britain getting really upset over the EU Northern Ireland Protocol and using that as an excuse to invade the Republic of Ireland. That's a very near parallel that you can see. Nobody today would think of that as a very logical thing to do, but that's almost exactly what you're seeing in Russia.
Apparently, Rafe, Putin's got it's either a statue or picture of Peter the Great, isn't he, in his study? That's his sort of inspiration, is it not?
There's an irony in that, because Peter the Great really looked to Europe in order to modernise Russia and to lead it into being able to compete again. But something that I think the Peter the Great comparison goes to is the civilizational level on which Putin is thinking. He is interested in this concept, as Rafe says, rather artificial and rather constructed, but an idea of the orthodox civilization, of the civilization of Holy Russia in some ways of putting it, and that as a force, which was, Russia is a demographically declining country, a very, very small economy relatively globally, and he's taken it by the scruff of the neck and tried to make it a great power again, and is conscious that he wants it to be seen as one. And all of this is about thinking in those terms. And so for him and this vision, Kiev particularly is critical to that. It is important for him in his theory to hold on to Kiev. And I think there's been a lot of naivety in the West. People who were thinking, oh, well, maybe he just wants Donbass, or he's arguing about that, or, oh, it'll just be the Crimea. I wrote about this when he took Crimea, that Kiev was the key point for him, because even then he was going there and making speeches and saying, this is where we all became one people. And people in the West don't think at that level. And so they haven't been able to see that it was very, very likely that he was always going to go for Kiev.
We failed to fully understand the risk posed by Putin, because democracies think in terms of parliaments, whereas the Russians are thinking in generational terms. They're thinking about the posterity of Russia, as you say, as a civilization. Do you think this is one of the reasons why we failed to properly assess? Not only, very similar, and I know that it's been compared by a few people, journalists, I think Fraser Nelson was one of them, to the 9/11 moment, that it was the same as we faced with Islamism, that we didn't really understand from a Western perspective that, for example, you could have groups that were motivated by religious ideology in this way, that we fail to understand how Putin could be motivated by these sorts of civilizational concerns, because it's something that is so verboten in Western thinking, to think in civilizational terms.
But but there's no excuse for this. This is absolutely inexcusable, because the Poles and the Estonians and the Latvians were saying this. This is what's remarkable. We should have seen this in 2008 when Putin went into Georgia. We should have seen this in 2014 when Putin went into Crimea. Now, I have to say, a lot of those people who criticize the West for the expansion of NATO are quite correct. The reason that he went into Georgia is because in 2007, there was a NATO meeting in Bucharest which published the famous Open Doors Declaration that said that the doors were open to those countries that wanted to join NATO, specifically Georgia and the Ukraine, and that was a red rag to a bull, and Putin did say that this was never going to be permissible, and a year later he went into Georgia. That should have been a wake-up call. The Poles warned about this. People were warning. And now look, nobody today can say that the Poles are stooges of the EU liberalism, that these are the woke establishment, all right? And that's one of the points I'm trying to get across here, is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend is a lovely adage, but it doesn't really apply in this case, because a lot of people on the right, I'm finding, quite disturbingly, are siding with Putin because they see him as an anti-woke character, a strong man standing up against the Western liberal establishment and against neocons. Well, I'm sorry, the Hungarians and the Poles also stand up against those same principles. So who do you want to side with? Do you want to side with Putin and his autocracy, or do you want to side with those true conservatives who actually espouse democracy at the same time, because they distrust Putin, and you have to choose your side?
This is a really interesting point, and I'm fascinated to know what you think of this, because my instinctive reaction when I saw people like Candace Owens, really in a way sort of touting Putin's propaganda line that this is to do with NATO's eastward expansion and these sorts of things, that there was this tendency on people on the right, people who very often I agree with, siding with Putin either in a shallow sense just simply because he's anti-woke, or actually agreeing that NATO in some way, NATO's presence in the region is aggressive and has provoked Putin. And then it turned into this sort of almost swamp of confusion where I think that people weren't sure who to look to for leadership in the same way, because the left and the right were so divided. And so people that previously agreed with each other didn't agree with each other on this particular issue. And you had, as we were discussing before we were recording, Neil Oliver being attacked on Twitter for simply not taking a view, saying that he, wasn't sure what he thought about it and he wasn't sure who to trust, which I think reflects a lot of what people are actually feeling, particularly because of COVID and so on. People are not sure which media sources to trust anymore. They're not sure if they can trust their own government's line. And it seems to have created this real mess. So I'm just curious to know what you think about that.
I mean, I would say that never underestimate people's ignorance about a situation. I mean, like what you've just described, for example, I'm sure it, would be unknown to many people. There is also this compulsion, I think, in social media and such like, to come up, first of all, with an opinion, but also you've got to have a position. And so much of life and politics is not quite like that. I mean, I don't know what Candace Owens is, not expertise, but even what her knowledge is of this particularly. I mean, and yet we find, this is half the problem, we find ourselves actually discussing what these various people think about it. And then you've got this situation over here which is sort of absolutely happening. I think that, to go back to your point, Emma, about, why did we not see and all of that, I think one of the reasons it's a very sort of simple thing, actually. It's an odd thing. He's around. So you see him with other statesmen, G8 or G9, wherever it might be. He had a state visit from the Queen, I think it was 2003, or rather they came here. He's sort of in the ambit, so that automatically people are less likely to think that this is some bloodthirsty.
In some ways, we view him as being a European leader when he very much doesn't view himself that way.
He's just like a bit of a shady one, or that's what they, that's how people thought of it. And I think this is why the overriding feeling I've come away from is sheer shock from people. They're just surprised, as it were, as keeping that he went this far. That's the feeling I'm taking away most.
Yeah, I think people, but again, this goes back to the idea that it's very hard to think your way into his head. People were like, this was not a rational calculation, because he has more or less put everything on the board, as is increasingly clear. He's being disconnected from the global economy in extraordinary ways. The Russian stock market is still closed, and who knows when it's going to open again. The sanctions against the central bank is this extraordinary process of being closed out on every level from everything around him. But for him, this is an existential issue, and one that he feels he has a very short window of opportunity, particularly because of his nuclear weapons that he has at the moment, where he feels he has a slight edge. And he thinks that, what has increasingly happened in the last week or so with the Ukraine, where it's moving towards NATO membership and EU membership and much closer into the arms of the West. He thought that was going to happen anyway on a longer timescale if he waited, and he's trying to stop it. But it's very hard for us to imagine that anyone would risk the prosperity of his people, the health of his nation, all his soldiers for something that seemingly abstract. But
were you surprised to see so many people on the right siding with Putin?
It was very disappointing to see, but I can understand in this sense.
Who are we talking about here? Like who?
I think there was a movement in the right. I mean, people like Tucker Carlson might be one example in America.
Surprising example, I think.
Yeah, I think so. But people looked at what had happened in Afghanistan and elsewhere and have been thinking in recent times, we would like to move away from wars that weren't really our wars, that we fought badly and we spent enormous amounts of blood and treasure, and to think a bit more about the people at home who we have neglected and left to OxyContin and decaying industrial cities and all of that, and that we would like to turn our focus away from the world. And so you can understand you don't want this to happen, but here it is. and it has happened. And this is a moment of moral clarity when people need to understand that, well, we need to be very careful about how far we take this so we don't escalate our way into World War III by accident. There is no taking ourselves away from this moment. We have to confront it.
I think.
But what I really want to do there is I want to reach out to those people on the right who support Putin, but who in every other aspect of their lives very much mirror my own views. And I want to say that opposing Putin doesn't mean you're siding with those EU liberals espousing these concepts which they find so difficult to take, which I can often find so difficult to take. There is another perspective, and there is truth to say. As I said before, it was the West expansion into NATO which provoked Russia. America was very foolish in how it acted towards Russia after the fall of communism, and its approaches to Yeltsin and so forth. There was genuine humiliation there, and Russia's a very proud nation, and great powers like Russia, which are naturally aggressive countries, when they're humiliated, they do strike out. That's all true. But that doesn't mean that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence. This is what I don't understand. Yes, you can say that NATO was wrong, that NATO provoked Russia to do this, but by what standard does Russia actually have the right to impose itself on those free nations of Central and Eastern Europe, upon the Ukraine, upon Moldova, upon Poland? Who says that that's right?
And
that's exactly the same as Spain being controlled by France, or Spain controlling Portugal, or Britain controlling Ireland. No one sees that right. If the Ukrainian people freely want to join NATO, let them. If the Polish people... And look, when Britain lost its empire, we established a Commonwealth of Nations, or free association, because the British Empire was a benevolent empire, in my view. I'm a great champion of the British Empire. Why was it that as soon as the Soviet Empire collapsed, they all went fleeing over to the other side and demanded to join NATO? NATO is a defensive alliance. This is the final point I want to make, sorry. NATO is not an aggressive force. The reason that these countries wanted to go there is because they know how cruel and barbaric the Soviet Union was, and the Russian governments always have been, and they wanted protection. The NATO is a reactive, so this idea that NATO would ever attack Russia is an absolute nonsense. There is no capacity for NATO to ever attack Russia. It reacts to Russian aggression, and that's what I want people on the right to really understand. That's a traditional conservative perspective.
By the same measure as well, you can be critical of the West without being pro-Putin, and I think that's something that's, like I mentioned, this attack on Neil Oliver for taking a more nuanced position, is that, it would be nonsense to suggest that the West doesn't bear some responsibility for this, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. If Germany hadn't allowed itself to be sort of encircled by dependence on Russian gas, if, we hadn't signalled, and this is something that I wanted to ask you about, whether you think that we have signalled through, as Oliver Dowden quite rightly put it, our decadence, focusing on pronouns and all of these things. And even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the head of MI6, we've seen the army, we've seen the security services focusing on white privilege pronouns and all of these things, while a very real war was about to take place and is taking place. Do you think that, when we talk about what sort of responsibility the West bears in this, do you think that we've signalled our weakness to
that's not the
Putin,
same as
to our
responsibility,
enemies?
is it? I mean, yes, we are considered weak, and frankly, quite rightly, when you look, when you look at the head of MI6, is it Richard Taylor? I think his name.
Moore.
Who was I don't know if I got his name wrong.
Richard Moore.
Richard Moore, talking about LGBT rights. While this is all going on, we've got to talk about LGBT rights, because this, more than any other thing, shows our difference to Russia, which, first of all, that's wrong. But secondly, I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed for him. I was embarrassed for the country. I was embarrassed as a gay man, actually. I thought, how dare you invoke, gays? And when people, not just Putin, but when any other serious country looks at that kind of thing, and they sort of think, what are these people on? What are these? But that all that does, it does show very clearly that not only are we weak, but we are stuffed with people who want us to fail, right?
But I think too, in fact, actually, that I feel more hopeful in a way in the middle of these terrible events, because I think it is already clear in some ways that Putin has made an enormous miscalculation, because he has looked at the very real decadence at the top of our institutions and the mad sort of things that we're obsessed by, and he has thought that the West is weak. And he doesn't understand the fundamental nature of the West, which Bill Buckley, the great American conservative founder of National Review, talked about back in the 50s. And he said that, however insisted, people need to realize that the West has the ultimate resource, which is moral in nature, and which is about its deep reliance on the individual, which goes very, very deep and ramifying into our civilization. We can have corrupt institutions, and yet still there are enormous wealth and resource of individuals who are ready to do the right thing and take in refugees or to go and fight and to stand up against tyranny when the moment comes. I mean, we may wait.
And you don't think that wellspring has been poisoned somewhat?
No. I think our institutions are crap at the top. But I think I look around in the last week or so and see how fast the West has moved and come together, sometimes a little too fast, a little too close to the line of nuclear war for my liking. But I think the world is starting to see the strength of the West, which is easily hidden behind this decadent veil. And that has led Putin into a place which is very, very dangerous for him and the world. But I think the West is stronger and is suddenly revealed as that than we might have thought.
What do you think of Marx's optimism?
There's an element of truth there. I mean, absolutely. Putin saw how weak we were over Georgia. He saw how weak we were over Crimea. He sees a Doolally Biden in the White House. He sees COVID crippling all these countries. He sees, Macron in an election, a new guy in Germany. He sees Boris Johnson occupied by cake all the time. And you've got the perfect sort of scenario for him here. He does think that the woke navel gazing that we're going through in this country is a sign of weakness. And if anything, his efforts have actually achieved the opposite. They have revived and revitalized the West. You see a strengthening. You see Germany and France, which really shamed themselves. We've just been in Hungary for a week. I can't tell you how many people, officials in Poland and Hungary, say Britain has stood up as our closest ally, and we now regard the UK as our strongest supporter, unlike the Germans and the French who dragged their heel because, as usual,
maybe Boris will actually be a good wartime leader in the end.
They pursued their economic self-interest. Yeah. But yes, but this has actually been, I think, an occasion for us all to take pride.
But also, I think one thing as well that because we haven't mentioned him yet, and that is the emergence of Zelensky has also been an embarrassment, and one which is much needed for our own political class. Because he was someone who was written off as an actor, a sitcom actor, in which I believe he was in a sitcom where he played the president of Ukraine, very bad, who was always stumbling and making bad decisions. Here he is, showing this extraordinary kind of on-the-ground leadership, and it's shown up the inadequacies, I think, of our own political class, and also something, because we had an event here just after coming back from Hungary with David Starkey, and it was quite moving. I was quite moved by it, actually, because he was very clear. He said, this is not what this shows, this whole conflict, is that there's no, when he said no such thing as universal values, he was talking about this kind of airy-fairy thing we have now, that we're all meant to fight for. He said, these people are not fighting for these things. They're fighting for their land, to use an old
It's not an abstract.
Yep, they are fighting for that, and it's unadulterated. And he was, I think, pessimistic about whether we would do that now. That's another debate. But I think it's very true. That was very clarifying, because I've always been, no, what is this thing, tolerance? Who's not going to say they're tolerant? I mean, all these kind of values that we supposedly fight, we don't.
What's also interesting as well about Zelensky is, and also just the way that because I think it was the morning after the invasion, I was doing a radio segment, a long radio segment. The whole thing was all about Ukraine. And throughout the day, all of these stories were coming in, particularly about the heroism of the Ukrainian people. Stories of like an old woman who handed an heavily armed Russian soldier some sunflower seeds, and he asked her what they were for, and she said to put them in his pockets so that they would grow when he died. And all of these incredible stories of heroism, like the guys on Snake Island who told the Russian warship to go and itself, and it's interesting to see the way that the Ukrainian people are being received in the media, their courage, their willingness to fight and defend their country. I watched an incredible interview on one of the mainstream media channels. I think it may have been Good Morning Britain or something. And they interviewed this British Ukrainian student, and she was talking about how she had made the decision. Obviously, she's a teenager. She's made the decision to stay in Ukraine, to fight for her country if necessary. And she was giving this really impassioned, almost speech of her patriotism, her attachment to her land, how it was so intrinsic to her identity that she felt that it was far more important than her own safety that she protected the existence of Ukraine. And it was interesting to see the way that was being received as, European people talking about a European country in a way that you never hear, and that you would never hear from a Brit, you would never hear from someone from France or from Germany, and it would almost be viewed as being unacceptable to be so passionately patriotic. And yet there's something about these stories of heroism and courage that are cutting through and that are really going to people's hearts. And I think there's something very, very real about this. And, before I said that I thought that COVID was going to get rid of all of the, silliness.
We all did, I think, Emma, didn't we?
And it turned out to be a stupid prediction and was very, very much wrong about that. It made it worse. But, there is something about this situation that seems to be, at least those stories of courage and heroism are reaching people.
What's so remarkable, or I should say remarkably depressing, is that those stories of heroism would have been unexceptional in the West until relatively recently. During the Second World War, Churchill encouraged housewives to sharpen a broomstick into a spear if they didn't have any weapon. You can always take one with you. That was his great line that he said to everybody. And he famously said, if the Nazis invade Britain, we shall carry on the fight until the last one of us lies lying on the floor, dying, choking in his own blood. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine that visceral imagery of choking in your own blood being said by a Western leader today? And that is the same sentiment you see alive today.
But to the extent that Zelensky is a Western leader, which he has increasingly become in the sort of by default in the last few days, and the way that has been taken is a sign that is now happening, and it is reawakening in all these countries like Britain and France and wherever, which has these traditions, and not so very far back. They're just a little encrusted over, as the old Horatius at the bridge, and how can men die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of their fathers and the altars of their gods? This is the great British Victorian sentiment there.
Also, there was the thing, yes, but the thing as well, that what goes through what Zelensky is saying and these people are saying, and indeed, like with Churchill, was the reason that the propaganda effort, if you like, was so successful is because it was basically true. It was more or less saying, we're not going to go down without a fight. That's quite different to the kind of vaingloriousness of like the, Russia and the kind of the vaingloriousness of, no, don't worry. Or
Zelensky is almost the authentic strongman.
Yes, exactly. It's sort of like, we are going to fight. Okay, it's terrible, right? It's weak, but we're going to fight. And that is far more inspiring, I would say, than this kind of for the greater good of the fatherland stuff.
And sort of from a position of strength. But of course, there is a big sort of Western tradition too. I think we forget because we've become so powerful in the world. The West has always been small and rough against the sort of Oriental empires. It was never a large thing. It was small cities like Florence. There's a reason why. The great statue by Michelangelo is of David facing up against Goliath. We think of it because it's tall and big, but it's a statue of the small, the weak, with a sling against the mighty.
Yeah, the thing is actually, because you're doing this series for us on the West. You might have to maybe make a few changes to the ending of it. Who knows? Whatever you might have been
It's
thinking
certainly
of.
even more topical than we might have thought it was. That's what I have been thinking in the last week or so. We see a great reawakening of the West as a meaningful concept. That's what I keep hearing on the news. The West, the West, the West. And as you say, Emma, we all thought at the start of COVID, or we hoped that maybe that would bring people back to reality. In some ways, this does it rather more because everyone has to change their energy policy. Everyone has to change their defence policy in Europe. That is not something that can go away. There is potential now for new leadership, new politicians to come forward in elections if the current crop can't change their stance fast enough. So, these things in some ways aren't going to go away, at least at the political level, and then at the cultural level as well. And it's hard to see a quick ending to this. We must say it seems quite likely that the brave Ukrainians are probably going to lose this fight, at least temporarily, and end up in some sort of insurgency or something. But it's hard to see it ending quickly, even if Russia can manage to sort of get its strategic ends.
Sorry.
So I just wanted to go back to Mark's point in saying that heroism is also part of the British character as well.
Yeah.
And absolutely, it is historically, but you wouldn't, I don't think, necessarily see as much of it today as you would have, as you've seen in the Ukraine. Now, of course, there are vast swathes of the great yeomen of England alive today who would absolutely and gladly pick up a pitchfork in defence of the nation. But there's a marked difference, and it's a complacency, it's nihilistic, it's a defeatist attitude. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe faced oppression and the loss of their sovereignty within living memory. They have been under the jackboot, the Nazi jackboot, and the Russian jackboot. And once communism fell, with great pride, they restored their national flags, their national honours systems, coats of arms, the symbols of sovereignty, and they cleave to those so strongly. Anybody who travels through Central Europe will see flags flying almost everywhere and coats of arms and symbols, as opposed to here, where we denigrate our culture, where we have this culture of self-loathing. And of course, those are homogenous societies, and we have had an influx of so many immigrants into this country that does have an effect in the nation
That's
of actually
crucial.
calling into question ideas of Britishness, and this whole idea of focusing upon the value of other cultures at the expense of the greater culture.
Yes, but I do believe in the possibility of renewal, and I think that's a Western trait too. I'll tell you what I've been watching the last few nights, and I'd recommend this to anyone, is to go back and watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy that Peter Jackson made, because that is it's a remarkable series of movies. It is long; it's like about 9 hours of film if you watch it. But then we binge watch things all the time these days. So
Speak for yourself, Mark.
that is a series of films about a decadent, aging men of the West who have forgotten how to stand up for themselves, and an evil that gathers while they are weak and divided and have evil advisors. And they're small and they're weak, and they know their follies and their inability to do it, and how they turn round and stand up and find a way to fight and defeat evil. And that is a very powerful Western story, and one that, you know, I think we can still learn from. I mean, conservatism tends to have an air of despair about it, but I do think the West has that capacity for renewal.
Do you think that there's been a lot of talk about the reaction of Russians at home, the fact that Russia's now gone into martial law to prevent people from protesting against it, and there's a question mark over the degree to which Russians are in favour of this or then not, because it would be very difficult for us to really know. But obviously there was talk of potentially this, if he failed, which I don't think that's on the cards anymore. It looks as if he's going to succeed in taking the whole of Ukraine. Do you think, firstly, that this could, potentially lead, as some suggested, to, obviously it's not going to lead to regime change if he's successful, but that there is a sort of discomfort amongst the Russian people that they are not necessarily the Russians that Putin believes that they are, that there's a kind of solipsism in the way that he's approaching this situation? And do you think that, this is something that potentially could lead to Putin going ever further, and so potentially invading other Baltic nations, somewhere like Lithuania, for example, trying to get to Kaliningrad?
Well, the first thing to remember here, in addition to his wanting to recreate the Russian Empire, and he's been doing this steadily. If you look at Azerbaijan, he's forced Azerbaijan into military agreements. It's the same thing with Kazakhstan. He's been doing this for quite a while, but it's all happened under the radar. People aren't aware of exactly. And Belarus, Ukraine and Belarus are the two states which have the closest sort of allegiances historically to Russia, and Belarus is completely under his control. There's an election coming up in 2024. And if you saw with the Crimean invasion in 2014, it happened in 2008. Whenever he gets to a sticky wicket, this is also part of his game plan. It's no coincidence that he's gone in there at this time, in addition to all of the other factors. He's also 70 years old. He wants to show himself as a strong man. How do you show yourself as a strong man when you're an aging man? It's by embarking upon these sorts of policies. And when you close down opposition media, there's a state narrative that's being put out. And the Russians, unlike people in the West, the Russians get almost all their news from the state media. They don't get the news from other sources on the internet and elsewhere. And so it's not unsurprising that there's a great deal of support at home for this, because, of course, they're not being told the full story. They still think, a lot of them still think this is all about Donetsk and the Donbass and Luhansk and everything like that. I personally don't think that there's any risk to the NATO countries at this stage. Who's to say that won't be the case in a few years from now? But I think this current plan was originally to see whether he could get a land bridge from Crimea to the Donbass region, to have sort of a land bridge over there and go forward into Kiev. I think he's been surprised at the reaction from the West, but I don't think there's any chance of this becoming an opportunity to topple him unless the West takes serious further actions, getting all the pension funds to withdraw their money from Russian businesses, not just having SWIFT limit some banks, limit all banks, ensure that no European businesses do any business with Russia. Only those sorts of things can force a recession in the country, which is what you need if you want to have an equivalent of a revolution.
Well, and let's confront the elephant in the room. I mean, what are you going to do about the energy? Because when we're buying 20% of our coal, 20% of our oil, 40% of our gas from Russia, we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars every day. It's
absolutely.
Don't you think some of this kind of like kick the Russians out? I mean, this is unacceptable, isn't it? I mean, we've had these Tory MPs saying expel Russians, I think, or they shouldn't be able to play football, ballet has been cancelled, this kind of... It seems like the wrong approach.
An anti-Putin activist who's a very good chess player has been thrown out of a chess tournament, things like that. Does seem the wrong approach.
Yes.
There's a wonderful proms concert that took place in 1968 on the day when the Russian tanks, the Soviet tanks, I should say, rolled into Czechoslovakia. The Soviet orchestra was over playing at the proms for the first time, and they had Rostropovich, greatest cellist in the world, and he was performing a piece by a great Czech composer. And nowadays, in the current situation, they wouldn't be allowed to perform, right? They would be cancelled and thrown off stage and all of that. But they performed, and Rostropovich performed in a way that was very, very clear. You couldn't say anything, that he was deeply sympathetic to the Czech cause. And these moments where culture and great music connects us and reminds us of the connection between our civilizations and the natural bonds there are between the West and the Orthodox civilization. And really, we must keep the focus on Putin. This is Putin's war. This is Putin's regime. And the Russian people are not our enemies in that sense.
Absolutely, 100%. We must ensure that we don't descend into Russophobia. And there's a balance to be had, and it's an important distinction to make, because I was completely opposed to, I think it was the Munich Orchestra that forced their pro-Putin conductor to denounce Putin. He refused to do it, and they fired him. Even though he's pro-Putin, I found that deeply disturbing and unsettling that would happen. I'm opposed to anybody being put into that predicament. Similarly, there are calls now for the Fabergé exhibition at London's Victoria and Albert Museum to go. I don't see the point. What is the purpose of that? But there is an absolute...
changing the chicken Kiev packets.
The point is, who in Russia will ever have heard about this Fabergé exhibition at the V&A? It gets to the point where we are sending messages to the Russian people because there are very few means that we have to let them know of how much we disapprove of them. So if it means banning their football teams, yes. If it means banning them from the Olympics, yes, because sporting is very important to them. If it means stopping their ballets from touring, yes, stop their ballets from touring. In the same way that we did that with South Africa over apartheid, it was the cultural and sports boycotts, actually, which were as powerful. The soft power of Russia is very much cherished by the Russians. If you can attack their soft power as much as their economic power, I think it's very valuable, so long as it's done on the level which actually hits home with the Russian people. There's no point in doing it for certain individual. I wouldn't do it for a tennis player, for example, but I'll do it for a Russian athlete at the Olympics because of the gold medal tally that they like to keep.
But even then, taking the yachts of oligarchs doesn't do much if they're still in the SWIFT payment system. I was going to ask what you think, what sort of message you think this sends to China, because we were discussing before we were filming that around the time of the invasion, Chinese planes were seen in Taiwanese airspace, and a lot of people have been discussing, as I say, signalling our weakness through all of us being caught up in our navel-gazing culture war stuff, and also the fact that we've shown that in a way, maybe we signalled to Russia over Hong Kong that if China can get away with what they did in Hong Kong, then maybe Russia can get away with what they're doing in Ukraine, and then that escalates to China thinking they can invade Taiwan. So obviously the Chinese and the Russians have been shown to be, in close communication about this. It seems that the Chinese knew that the invasion was coming before it happened. Do you think that we are sending a message to China that is going to have broader global implications in terms of a realignment of geopolitical power in the world?
Well, I mean, if it was a strong message, that would be good. But we've got a hell of a lot of ground to make up. A hell of a lot of ground. Because, I mean, one of the great scandals of the past, 10, 20 years has been the way we've indulged China, not just indulged China, but actually sort of like welcome them in. This is one of the great unreported things, I'd say, for most people. The amount of infiltration that there is in our institutions by China, the amount of financial and cultural influence that there now is.
So in a way, the dependency is even more than Germany's
Exactly.
on Russian
and the
gas.
extraordinary silence during the COVID thing, when it came to China. Now, by the way, it's entirely acceptable to say that this was possibly a leak from the Wuhan Institute. That's now quite, but for a while that was absolutely verboten. Right? So basically there's an awful lot of ground to make up. I just wanted to go back to one thing actually you mentioned, Emma, before as well. And that is that, when we talk about, and Rafe, when we talk about the way that people are reacting in a very sort of pro-Putin way and everything. The only sympathy, the sympathetic response I can make to that is that people feel over the past 10 years, that they've been systematically lied to, right? I'm not saying it's right, but I'm just trying to explain it. And essentially with Brexit and now with COVID, you have had all the organs of the state, more or less, and the media singing from one hymn sheet. And basically that's turned people, so they might be wary, because one thing that has been interesting about this is that there's wall to wall, from what I can see, as one. The media are as one about this, about the Ukraine. Good. Right. But there are going to be people who say, well, what's the agenda here? Because they've become used to, they've become so untrusting. And you can't sort of blame them for that. But it is wrong in this instance.
No, but I agree with you 100%. And I understand all of the reasons why people are supporting Putin. And I also understand that Ukraine isn't a perfect country as it's now being portrayed in the West. There is rampant corruption in the country. It's not a proper democracy. But this is not whataboutism. Every criticism you can make of the Ukraine, you can make tenfold about Russia. And this is one of the issues. But my whole purpose, really, the main thing I want people to get from this is that you can oppose Putin without siding with the left-wing woke elements. And my point was, the same people who admire Putin and who are defending him are the same people who admire Poland and Hungary. And if you admire Poland and Hungary, you can't admire Putin, because they're globally completely opposed in terms of the threat that they feel from Putin.
But there is also the other point. There is one feels in some ways sort of slightly vindicated. I mean, if one's going to be self-obsessed, you should think, vindicated about defence. Running our defence right
Suddenly
down.
Germany wants to meet its 2% GDP.
Hello? I mean, it's extraordinary. Even a small amount. Running these things right down. Again, Germany, for the political class, Merkel was some kind of idol, I would say. Bang, gone like that. Any kind of reputation she might have had, gone. Overnight. And, so basically where one was sceptical before, or actually opposed to something, now that you feel actually, yes, and also the other thing is very, very important. You were talking about the wonderful stories that you're seeing of this very moving, very touching story. Yes, because the media as well is reporting them in a sympathetic way. Wouldn't that be nice if it were applied here instead of sneer, constant sneer? I'm not saying that people are being entirely manipulated by the media, but it's being put forward. Look at this wonderful man. Look at this wonderful woman. What they're doing, and you sort of think, actually, why don't you put your own house in order as well?
Here's the question, though: now, maybe Germany are meeting their defence spending targets for NATO. Maybe this will wake us up out of the decadent navel gazing, and we will recognise that there are real enemies out there. I think it was Lionel Shriver wrote a fantastic piece in The Spectator either today or yesterday, saying that we're seeing the return of actual badness as opposed to fake badness, and actual misinformation as opposed to fake misinformation. That maybe this will boot us into reality, because I think a lot of that shock, the initial shock, was seeing that this could happen on the European continent, because in the lifetimes of most people alive, this is not something that we've really seen in this way before. And so do you think that, despite, maybe this kicks us and makes us wake up to it, maybe Germany starts spending more money on defence, maybe we start to gradually wean ourselves off of dependency on Russia and China and recognise that there are real wolves out there in the forest, but is it already too late? Are we already seeing, like I said, this geopolitical realignment that is not in the West's favour, that essentially the years of Western dominance, in some senses, really now actually starting to come to an end?
Well, I think it's extraordinary. If you look at the map of the votes in the UN, in the General Assembly about Russia, a lot of people condemning it, but the key powers that were siding with Russia, or at least willing to abstain. So there's a sort of giant, if you look at it as a world map, it's a giant block across Asia, because of course you've got China, very strikingly, and I think people aren't worried enough about this, you've got India as well.
Really?
And Pakistan, of course, has been very intimate in its relations with Putin. And in a coming Asian century, it is extremely worrying that this gigantic area of land with very, very many people in it is not there ready to condemn this. And I think there are signs there of real problems ahead. And of course, India does have its own issues with a sort of religious nationalism, sort of Hindu nationalism, that may yet become an issue in the years ahead. And I do think people need to go back and read Samuel Huntington, because I think his book on civilizations suddenly makes much more sense even than it did when he wrote. Now, he was somewhat relaxed about Russian civilization because he thought it was demographically too weak. It wasn't going to be a problem. He didn't envisage a Putin coming along, but he saw it as a meaningful civilization. And India as well, and China, of course. And that level of thinking is going to be increasingly useful to us as we move into this more multipolar world where these civilizational powers want to do things in their own way and with their own values.
Would you say that we're moving away from an era of nation states into an era of civilizations again? In an era of empires?
I think that they weren't mutually exclusive. I think civilization and nation states were strong at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Or empires, then, maybe, would be a better way of putting it.
Yeah, there's a short-term and a long-term answer here. The long-term answer is that Asia has dominated the world for 10,000 years. We've only really been a superpower force for 250 years. Since the 1750s, people don't seem to understand that. Prior to the Industrial Revolution and the advance of our navy and so forth, we were just an afterthought. The real civilization was in China and
it's the barbarians
and
in
in
the
India,
cold.
we very much were. Now, we've created the modern world. So the world today is a Western world. The idea of the individual, no civilization has had a better or more positive impact on the world than Western civilization. That's been our great gift. But we are being eclipsed by these other powers, and because of immigration, we're committing, I would say, long-term, a slow suicide, the longest suicide note in history, as someone once said. That's the long-term view. The short-term view, though, is that Western civilization and the power of the West has actually been helped by what's happened now in the short term, in terms of stemming or slowing our gradual decline, because you've seen this revitalization of the West, but you've also seen a strengthening of NATO, a removal. Germany and France and others are going to remove themselves away from Russia's energy markets, but Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO now, I think that's hugely encouraging. China as well has seen the reaction to Russia, and you can see China now considering that and adjusting it. It was no coincidence, I think, that Putin has done this also so soon after meeting the president of China at the Olympics in China, where they had this private summit. And I was convinced when he went into the Ukraine that there had been a discussion about this. And I think China assumed this would be a very quick, speedy takeover, and they've been shocked at how slow it's been. They've been shocked at the Western reaction, and it's almost as if Russia is the sort of testing ground for experiments. In the 1980s, they saw that glasnost and perestroika proved that a communist regime should have economic reform, not political reform. Russia experimented there and they realized that was the wrong model. Now they've seen the attack on the Ukraine and thought, all right, this is not actually the best for us. Let's readjust our policy on Taiwan. We'll go about it a different way. But also, more importantly, let's make sure that our economy is autonomous, that we have security safeguards so that we don't have a SWIFT, our reserve central bank, our reserves not being accessible to our central bank. All of the tools we've used against Russia actually may no longer work against China in the future because they've learned this lesson. And that actually could be a greater crisis. So in a way, we may have revealed our hand to the Chinese.
So in the long term, you're pessimistic on that front?
Yeah,
then?
very pessimistic. But I think in the short term, I think we've improved our chances.
In the very short term, though, I have to say I'm slightly concerned because I think, particularly in Europe, the EU powers are really not very used to thinking of themselves as sort of strong military powers. The EU has suddenly emerged as what's clearly going to be a sort of military power. They're talking about armies much more openly again. They're giving arms and so on, and they're being quite aggressive in their statements. And I just feel like they've woken up, but they've woken up and now they're really keen and excited in that way of people when they step into a new role. And this is very delicate negotiations. America knows how to handle nuclear brinksmanship, but I worry about the EU.
What do you think is going to happen next? Or what do you think should happen next?
God, that's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, obviously, the strengthening, to carry on from Mark's point, the strengthening of the West is a great thing, so long as it's not just a structural thing. In the sense
spiritual revitalisation is what you're after.
Yeah. No, it's a point. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really, because when you talk about navel gazing, we've been talking about navel gazing. I would say that it's more than that. It's not just the indulgence that comes from a very prosperous society. It's actually pure kind of utter self-laceration that we've been putting up with for years, reaching a pitch. If that really, because we had this conversation before, we had the conversation before COVID came along, oh, this is all going to go because, we've got a real, thing. Well, I would say actually that this is far more important actually in an odd way. And if this doesn't rid us of our kind of woke obsessions and our desire to obliterate ourselves, then nothing will.
I think that, perhaps I'm just have become overly pessimistic, but the fact that we had, as you mentioned, Richard Moore, the head of MI6, putting out this tweet about LGBTQ,
it's
whatever
so
it was,
month,
and that we had the army taking, and bear in mind that presumably the army has intelligence about things in advance, that on the 8th of February we had the army taking this diversity training day where they all took a day off of doing any work that was unnecessary, though you would hope that the army wouldn't do any work that was unnecessary, that it suggests that even when sort of, and to use a phrase that I think is awful and overused, that when we're at the coalface and we are faced with real, practical, strategic wake-up calls, that even still those people who are at the helm, and I know, Mark, you mentioned, that it's sort of rotten at the top of these institutions, but if those people at the helm are still distracting themselves with these things, or as you mentioned with the tweet from Richard Moore, trying to twist the situation, and same with the diversity training in the secret services, saying that that diversity and all of these sorts of things, having gender neutral language or whatever, was key to having a strong defence for the UK. That if they're able to sort of like twist these things and try to make them fit and still allow themselves to be distracted by them. I know that there have been a few journalists who have pointed out that this needs to be this should be a point at which we realise that we have to go back to the old way of thinking about these things, to be focusing on geopolitics more strategically and so on. But it just, to me, seeing the people at the helm saying these things at this time and thinking it is appropriate to do so suggests to me that the folly is so deeply ingrained that even if the majority of people wake up to what's going on, those people who are in positions of authority are just not getting the bigger picture.
But I would say that has been the case throughout. The majority of people are aware. The majority of people have not lost that wisdom, right? They haven't. It's these people in the institutions, like the guy you've just mentioned at MI6, these are the people who are emblems of the rot, right? And they are, as you say, hugely embedded in our education system. Unbelievable, what's going on in the education system. People don't actually quite, understand quite how chronic the situation is. But I would say that, how many more chances are we going to have to grow up again? Because this is what it is. It's becoming an adult again. Because all the stuff we're talking about is basically infantile.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for Whoopi Goldberg to come on television and say this is just between two bunches of white guys. That's what we got used to.
It is juvenile. Actually, I've got it written down here. This day that the security services, this diversity training that they had, was called Mission Critical, and it just sounds like the sort of thing that you might do in a school as a kind of like an exercise. It's not the sort of thing that a serious security services or serious military should be involving itself with. And surely that the message that sends, regardless of whether or not the majority of people are aware of what's going on, the message that sends to real enemies like China and Russia is that we're not a serious force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, but in recent days, there is all of that clearly, and it's not going to go away quickly. But in recent days, we have been leading the way in Europe. Boris has been doing great work. We have been giving arms. We've been training Ukrainians for years, happily, and that is having a decisive advantage, and that side of us is being shown. And I think it is already clear that there are real and very concrete political choices that need to be made about policy that people are going to vote for. And that is something that politicians are going to have to reckon with, particularly as our energy bills are going to continue to go. They're already going through the roof before this even happened, and now they're going to go even more. Questions around nuclear power, around net zero, around energy independence, the North Sea gas, fracking. We need to make grown-up decisions about those, and there is going to be a political constituency for that in a way that there wasn't before, and for a stronger military, which I don't think people have realised. Most people have realised how it's been hollowed out in recent years.
That's been the big wake-up call of this experience. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. At its most base level, this is about strength and decisiveness. These are the two core values that the Ruskies and the Chinese really understand and appreciate. And it's the lack of strength, it's the lack of confidence, it's the lack of decisiveness by the West that is manna from heaven for these powers, and they've tried to seize on those opportunities, and that's why we've seen this Ukrainian invasion. And so if we really want to ensure that we have a strong stamp on the world going forward, we have to show decisiveness, we have to show strength, and we have to be willing to make sacrifices.
So on that note, strength and decisiveness, that's what we need. So that is the end of this episode. We will see you next time. Please like, subscribe if you feel that way inclined, and we will see you next time with the New Culture Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.